Welcome to Realpolitik, a podcast where we tackle pressing issues in global affairs by proposing policy solutions to the governments of Canada and the United States. In today's episode, I'll have the pleasure of having on Dr. Barbara Perry to discuss right-wing extremism in Canada. Dr. Perry is a professor of criminology and justice, specializing in right-wing extremism, hate, and terrorism at Ontario Tech University. She is also the director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism there. As mentioned at the end of the episode, for those interested in a deeper dive into this topic, I highly recommend consulting the recent report conducted on Canada by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which Dr. Perry contributed to. I also recommend checking out her 2019 book entitled Right-Wing Extremism in Canada. Here's our discussion on the topic. Hi, good morning.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm tired. I just want Trump to go away so my life can go back to normal.
Only a week or so.
Yeah, well, it'll take a while. There'll be a hangover effect for a
Oh, I'm
little while,
sure.
I'm
I'm
afraid.
sure. His
Yeah,
supporters are here to stay, but he'll go,
yeah.
hopefully. Thanks for coming on, by the way.
Yeah, sure.
So I reached out to you because, well, you went on Phil's show a couple times, and he's a good friend of mine, and I've been following your work, and we even quote your work in my terrorism class. So I thought you'd
Oh,
be a very good guest, especially in light of what happened last week in DC.
timing is good. Times are bad, timing is good.
That's right. So to start us off, basically, I'll just go into what we'll be discussing today. So there'll be definitions, just to kind of set the stage and make sure that we're all on the same page and make sure that everything's understood the same among our listeners. Then we'll go into context up to present day, both in Canada and the U.S., but we'll focus on Canada, and then we could talk about what you think might happen in the next decade, and then what your recommendations might be in terms of policies. And we'll be discussing right wing extremism and terrorism, since that's your forte. So, just to start us off, do you think you could define some terms that you would want us to, or I could propose some terms that you might want to
Yeah.
define?
Why don't you select them?
Hmm.
Have a better sense of, I think, what your audience might be interested in. So we'll go that
Sure.
direction.
Well, one of the first terms I always get asked about is what is right wing exactly? What is a right wing ideology? Because there's so many. You could talk about religious conservatism. You could talk about libertarianism. There's so many kinds. There's anti-government sentiments, even anarchism is part of it. So, could you go into detail about what right wing ideology might look like when we talk about extremism?
Sure. Yeah. And let's think about it in terms of right-wing extremism and not just right-wing ideology, because that's really what I'm interested in. And for me, I mean that term is really an umbrella term. You suggested it is very diverse, and in fact, yeah, that is very much the case. So when we're referring to right-wing ideology as an umbrella term, we're thinking about those ideologies, those parts of the movement that are very traditional, and I would say, in fact, reactionary in their ideologies, want to turn the clock back in terms of the rights extended to others, in terms of, inclusion and multiculturalism and all of those pieces that they think threatens the supremacy of that sort of white European dominance in cultural terms in particular. So I think that that's the umbrella term that we often use, and different variations. Right-wing extremism, far-right extremism, extremist right-wing, those sorts of ideologies. So it does encapsulate a whole array of other elements of the movement. So when we do presentations, we've got this little, and I want to change it. It's a bunch of bubbles, sort of in a circle, with the different pieces of the movement. But I think it's important because it looks like they're independent, but I think it's important to think about it as a Venn diagram, really, that we've got these multiple pieces that have some points of intersection and overlap, in particular around that very notion of sort of turning back the clock, if you will. There's typically sort of some shared foundations around white supremacy, and the inferiority of other other communities. But beyond that, there is incredible variation in terms of the specifics of their ideologies, how they express them, the language they use, their likelihood of engaging in violence, the sort of just on a number of very distinct variables, if you will. So what we got? We've got, I think, maybe about 10 or so in our cluster. Probably not exhaustive. I'm sure there are others that we haven't included. When we're really, I think, focusing on the most evident ones, and they include, the traditional neo-Nazi or skinhead groups, the white supremacist groups, but we've added to that sort of recent, much more specific elements of the movement, including, the anti-Muslim segment of the movement, the incel element, and some people think, well, why is that part of the far right? Well,
Hmm.
misogyny and patriarchy have long been from the get-go embedded in white supremacist discourse, because you can't have white racial purity without controlling your women. So that incel, that misogynistic ideology, is also sort of a part of the movement, if you will.
Are there
Um,
other parts of the movement that you would include that some wouldn't? So you mentioned incels. That's one big one where there's a lot of disagreement among the terrorism community, anti-terrorism community, research community about whether that's part of the definition. Are there
yeah,
other
I
groups you
think
would say?
I think given the kind of definition that we've adopted, that notion of reactionary, is sort of a return to traditional values and um, um, social social relationships, then I think, yeah, incel absolutely fits into that cluster, if you will. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, it's overlapping, right? Doesn't I mean, some incels do integrate, racialist themes, racist themes. Not all do, but they do share that misogyny that is part of the old fashioned right
Hmm.
wing, if you will. Um, we've included the accelerationists. I mean, that's something, not necessarily new, but it
Pretty
is.
recent movement.
Yeah, but I mean, accelerationism has always been a part of the movement as well, right? In terms of the racial holy war and trying to
Hmm.
provoke that. So this is the new manifestation, I think, of that element. So the Boogaloo Boys, those sorts of groups, where the intent is really to promote and to accelerate, as the term suggests, some kind of civil war, whether that's a racial war or an all-out civil war. And so they are happy as pigs in mud this past week to see what's happened in the U.S. I think they see that as the beginning of the Civil War. We've
Hmm.
got the alt right, which, for me, is it any different? I mean, they share the same fundamental white nationalist values as so many of the others. The only thing that's alternative about them is their presentation of self. They tend to be better educated, more erudite, more articulate, dressed in their fancy clothes rather than the black uniforms. But at heart, they're not that much different. They're not really an
Hmm.
alternative part of the movement, except and that presence. What else we have?
But that's a
Anti-authority movement.
just to speak on the all right, it's kind of a central part of the white supremacist movements. They've been changing their labeling forever. They've gone from Nazis to neo-Nazis to white supremacists to race realists, whatever that means, and
Yeah.
now the alt right. So I would say that it's always been their way of reinventing themselves to kind of have to not face the music.
Right. Yeah. To present themselves in a more sanitized way, right, and much more credible. I mean, it harks back to the 70s and the 80s when David Duke, the Grand Wizard of the KKK, said, throw off your white hoods and put on your business suits.
Right.
It's very much the same in contemporary terms. It parallels that very nicely.
Hmm. And so, did you have any other groups in mind, or
I think
still a lot?
the anti-authority is probably the last one, anti-authority movement, if you will, within this broader movement. And that's an interesting one because I mean it's across the spectrum. So this is why that notion of a Venn diagram is so important, because there are distinct elements of that movement that are left wing, that are centrist, that are apolitical, but there's also a very distinct element of the movement that is very much right wing and in ideology. Again, promoting racist ideologies. One of their complaints about the authority of the state is that they've gone too far on immigration, on multiculturalism, on those sorts of issues. So we're seeing that sort of that element of the movement really come to the fore again in the form of some of the conspiracy theorists
Hmm.
that are emerging right now. So that anti-authority movement has really regained some traction in the last year or so.
And would you include preppers and doomsday preppers and I
Oh,
guess
absolutely. Yeah. And
anarcho-primitivists
that's
and
when, yeah, we sort of need to add in here. Maybe it's hard to say. What do we call them, right? They're not really militias in the American sense. Maybe the patriots is a way to think about them. But yeah, absolutely. So groups like the Three Percenters,
Mhm.
for example, that are,
Which have spilled over to Alberta and Canada.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're armed. Many of them are trained in military or paramilitary actions, and they're xenophobic. I mean, that's a really dangerous combination to have
Hmm.
those three pieces together. So, yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you reminded me that. We need to add them in
For
here.
sure. I guess that brings me to what groups you think, because we've defined, the ideologies they represent, but which groups do you think would be most dangerous, most organized, most prepared? You mentioned Three Percenters. There's a bunch of other American groups that have spilled over to Canada. The KKK is one of them. Of course, they've been here for about 100 years, but there's some more. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. Where to start and where to end? We're identifying in our current project closer to 300 active groups in the Canadian context, and that's up from 100 in our the estimate that we presented in our 2015 report. So a dramatic growth in the movement. The in terms of the ones that I think are most dangerous, I think three percenters are among the most dangerous. And I think the Proud Boys have the potential. We haven't seen the same kind of violence from them in Canada as we've seen in the U.S., but I think that they are emboldened by the success as they see it of their counterparts to the south. So I think there's the potential for that here. We are seeing signs of the base in Atomwaffen, which are sort of old school neo-Nazi groups, if you will, and really founded on violence, not just on racism and anti-statism, but on violence. That is sort of bread in the bone for those groups, and we are seeing evidence of them here. Patrick Matthews,
That's right.
obviously the reservist, who was outed just a few no, just a couple of years back, I guess.
Hmm.
It had it's connected to the base.
Do
So
you
those are
think?
probably the most dangerous ones.
Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you think his arrest kind of made the base, retract their activities a little bit, or do you think it emboldened them?
No, I think I don't know that it will. I don't think it changed their patterns at all. They are certainly still actively recruiting in the Canadian context. So yeah, they'll continue to do so. They just see that as a minor blip, right? They've lost one soldier, but there are many more to follow them, and literally soldier from both perspectives there.
Mhm. The reason I ask is because if you go to the Incel movement and even the white supremacist movement, if you talk about Bissonnette and other people like that, they've been emboldened by the arrests that were made by of Alec Manassian and Bissonnette more recently. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the arrest, but it's also just those individuals and their actions that they're celebrating and glorifying. So it's those individuals that they're martyrs for them. They're not dead. Well, not all of them are dead, but martyrs in death and martyrs in apprehension as well. So
mhm.
the yeah, I mean the arrest, and I think there was something. It was in some respects quieter around Matthews because he hadn't been engaged in horrific acts of violence like some of these others. He was just a recruiter, so not as much to celebrate around him, but often there is that sort of backlash. I think we're seeing it in the context of what happened in Washington, that the arrests are further angering the supporters of the movement. So there is that potential.
And do you think that's what's behind the government reaction to these groups and to their activities, where you don't want to escalate, but you also do want to apprehend these groups and stop their activities and prevent them from acting upon their ideology?
No, I don't think that's the explanation for their
Okay.
hesitancy to act. I think it's just, they've been very slow to the game in terms of recognizing the threat associated with the far right. The challenge is that, as we're seeing more and more, especially out of the U.S., no reason to think it's that much different in Canada. There is sympathy amongst law enforcement, amongst military, for those ideologies, those values that are shared, and positions that are shared by some of these far right groups. And so, it's not that far from normative, especially in this context, right, where sort of the center has moved dramatically to the right. The mainstream and the extreme are blurring more and more. So I think that we haven't seen the far right as a threat because they're just too close to traditional racist beliefs that are widespread in uh, our cultures, Canadian and American both. So I think that has more to do with our failure to intervene. They look like us, therefore they can't be dangerous.
Right. And even I saw the spokesperson for the three percenters in Alberta saying that they're with law enforcement and they have law enforcement in their ranks.
Hmm.
And if
Hmm.
you look at the base, well, Patrick Matthews was a CAF member. He was
Yeah.
a reservist. And so you have a lot of armed forces personnel who joined these groups as well. So you're
Yeah.
definitely right in pointing that out. And there have been reports by the CAF. Well, they haven't really acted on them, but they've done a lot of reports, both in the RMC, which is their military college, and in the CAF and the reserve specifically, about countering extremism and rising tendencies to extremism in the ranks. But
Hmm.
they haven't
Yeah,
really acted upon them.
we're actually funded right now by DND, a network on. It's a very long name, this network, but network to study the relationship between right-wing extremist activity and military engagement. So, trying to unpack some of that. What is at this point, anecdotal data, right? We have a handful of people who have been identified. Uh, is it more extensive than that? At what point do they come into, or at what point are they recruited, or at what point are they vulnerable, and how do we better intervene? As you know, D&D just introduced in all branches, a concrete policy on right-wing extremism and
That's
hateful
right.
conduct. And for the military, that policy came together really quickly. Now the next step obviously is to act on that, and to develop policies and ways to intervene, to both prevent it and respond to it when they see it.
From what I saw, it was mostly the CAF and DND encouraging people within the ranks of law enforcement and the military to kind of oust their colleagues. Do you know if there was more of a wider systemic policy, or was it more personal responsibility based?
Well, as I say, it's early days. I mean, those policies were only introduced in the fall, so they're still sorting out how to, what that means, who has responsibility. I mean, certainly they are calling on not just rank and file, but on leadership as well to identify it when they see it. I think our research is part of that, trying to identify where the problems are. And if are there regional differences? Are there differences between the reserve and the regular? All of are the differences across branches? We don't even know that. They I think they don't really know enough to intervene. About They don't know enough to know where and how to intervene at this point, I think.
Hmm. And to get back to the root of the problems that you mentioned, well, would you say that right wing terrorism or right wing extremism or hate is more pervasive than you mentioned left wing, centrist, other ideological or even Islamist extremism, what kind of strand would you say is most pervasive and most dangerous?
Well, I mean, what is the left wing right now? I mean, people talk about Antifa and and try to and sort of assign some moral equivalency between the left and the right. I mean, the right wing is, and the groups that we're talking about here are explicitly created to challenge, to vilify, to engage in violence, to promote violence against particular communities. The left is inherently even anti it is what it says, anti-fascist. They emerge to challenge and to confront these reactionary kinds of movements. They're not grounded or founded in violence in the same way. They're not looking to overturn the current order. They're not looking to beat women back into submission
Hmm.
as the far right is. So to claim any equivalency is just absurd. I will say I think that there are probably more people who sympathize and affiliate with what we think of as the left than with the right. If you look at the demonstrations and the rallies that some of these groups have planned, they'll come out, there'll be 20, there'll be 50, maybe 100 on a good day, and you'll have hundreds, if not thousands, of sort of and not all people who would identify as left wing, just people who are anti-fascist,
Hmm.
who value or who respect core Canadian values of equity, inclusion, and respect for diversity.
Hmm.
So yeah, there are more people that sympathize with that um, orientation than the far right.
And they're
But
not remotely as organized or armed as the right
no,
wing
it's a
are.
movement. They're not groups. It's a
Right,
movement.
exactly.
Antifa is not a group, right? It's a movement. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there is anti-fascist Toronto, but still, it's a pretty loose sort of online collective who strategize about how to confront and how to meet the far right protests on the ground.
And they usually gather with more mainstream movements and protests. Usually they're accepted into broader like climate change protests, or they're usually welcomed in these events, whereas the right-wing extremist groups are definitely
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
Usually,
Again, on
let's
the
say
left, it's the
conservative
sim.
party would not like to be affiliated with extremist ideological types or
Right,
groups.
right. Yeah, most wouldn't.
Most.
Yeah.
Some might, but
There are some
I'm not going to
exceptions, yeah.
mention names.
Some go
And
and create their own parties where they sort of do invite them in.
yeah, I definitely. That's a good one. And talking about parties, so the election is probably coming up either the spring, summer, or fall. Do you think that might have an impact on right-wing extremism and extremism in general?
I think in any other year, it wouldn't, but this year, so many things are conspiring against us. I think the pandemic has certainly brought people out of the woodworks, especially rallying around some of the conspiracy theories that have a particular home within the far right as well. Not all, I mean, but many of them do, or the right wing is more likely, I think, to absorb those into their ideologies. So I think that the people who are and sort of the anti-authority, anti-state contingent who resist the masks, who resist the lockdowns, who resist the vaccine, all of that sort of piece might be drawn into the more extreme, sort of traditional right, if you will. You add to that what we're seeing in the U.S. right now. I mean, is that inspiration, right? Will they try to imitate what we've seen there? And again, we do have some pretty small scale, low key anti-state demonstrations ongoing, and throughout the summer and most of the fall. Not sure. I think they're still there periodically. There was, and you'll know better than I, being in Ottawa, Revolution Canada or Canadian Revolution, who were on Parliament Hill, camped out on Parliament Hill, ready to arrest any politician that
Right.
they thought sort of contravened whatever their ideals were. Corey Hurren, right, who rammed his truck onto the grounds of Rideau Cottage in the summer on July 2nd with arms, including two assault weapons, who was going to arrest and talk to the prime minister. So these are the signs that there are people willing to go that direction.
Hmm.
And will they be emboldened by what we've seen in the U.S.? I think part of that will depend on what happens this week in terms of how those planned protests are managed in the U.S. If they're defined as successful, whatever that means for these groups, it could promise challenges for us. So I think the further out our election is, um, the more removed we are from these events, and perhaps we can be a little more reassured.
I definitely agree with that. And there was even support last Wednesday for the American protest storming the Capitol. In Toronto, there were some caravans of trucks with Trump flags and
Hmm.
libertarianism flags, and
Yeah. Well, there were similar, not the caravans, but other kinds of protests, street protests, in at least half a dozen cities across the country. So it was not just isolated to Toronto. And the online chatter is even more blatant in their support. And leading up to the events planned for this week, they're talking about you know. Trying to cross the border to support their colleagues and their brethren, and if they can't get across the border, then they will stage their own protests and events, whatever that might look like here.
talking about the United States, do you think the state of extremism, especially right-wing extremism in Canada, is the same state as it is in the U.S., or do you think it has the potential to get there, or none of the?
Um, it's proportionately probably as extensive. I mean, it's a hard thing to say in terms of proportionality, but I think proportionately it's maybe as broad, maybe not as violent.
Hmm.
I think that we haven't seen. I mean, there's a long history in the U.S. of armed robberies to defend themselves, that sort of thing, of massive attacks, and like, I mean, the Oklahoma City bombing. And I'd like to think we won't see, and we haven't seen, and we won't see things like that. We've certainly seen heinous things like the shooting in Quebec City, and the murder by van in Toronto just a couple of years ago. But it's still fairly far and few between. So again, I like to think that we won't sort of go quite to that same extreme as the U.S. in terms of the frequency and the kind of violence we see there.
So you'd say we have about as much, well, proportionally, we're about 10% of their population. Proportionally, we have about the same number of supporters of these ideologies, but not necessarily the same amount of people who are ready to act upon those
Yeah, I think
ideologies.
that's probably a good way to put it. I mean, if you think we've got 300 active groups in a population of, what are we saying now, 38 million, 40
Hmm.
million,
Around
whatever.
there.
Yeah. And the US, yeah, 10 times our size. They have less than 3,000. Well, Southern Poverty Law Center identifies less than 3,000. So,
Good for
disproportionately.
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say that's a victory, but
Yeah.
and that's also prominent in the studies I've read, where Canada proportionally is doing much worse than it should. In that, so online activity is very prevalent in Canada. I think we make up about 6% of extremist activity online, according to a recent British study. Same goes with the groups. We have more groups than we should have proportionally if we compare to the UK or other
Mm-hmm.
European countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think you're talking about the ISD report, which is
That's
part of
right.
our project. They're our partner on the current project. Yeah, I mean, identified 6,600 active platforms, and that was only looking at sort of a couple of the mainstreams and a couple of the fringe. We haven't looked at all of those fringe platforms that are starting to topple now. Makes our work much more difficult.
Right.
But also, I mean, if you look at the two, some of the more extreme platforms like Iron March, when that was revealed, Canada was in the top three in terms of active engagement. So that we were so actively engaged in the worst of the worst is I think worrying.
Do you think the transition to social media since the 1990s, that's been harder for you and terrorism researchers to follow, or do you think that's been a good way for you to, because a lot of them encrypt their material and it's even harder to access than if you just had a warrant and could just search their premises. But
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, really, because there is still an awful lot of activity, that's on open forums. So even on traditional platforms,
even Reddit, YouTube, Twitter,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So in some respects, it's made our life more complicated in that there's so much data, and there's so much to gather and to watch. But that's also made it easier, right? Because we know what the chatter is, we know what the conversations are, but we also know that's the tip of the iceberg, that the worst of the worst is on, as you suggest, those encrypted platforms that we can't get to, law enforcement often can't even get to. So we rely on often journalists who have managed to infiltrate particular groups, that sort of thing, to see what's behind the curtain, if you will. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I'm not a quantitative researcher, and I'm certainly not tech savvy. So fortunately, we have partners in our networks who do some really incredible work with those big data, scraping some of those platforms, and analyzing them for us, and just some remarkable, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of the themes and the sorts of commentary that you see there. It really helps us get an insight into the movement.
And do you think infiltrating these movements and just following their chatter on mainstream platforms is enough, or do you think there should be more that's done by more encrypted and more anonymous platforms to oust these individuals and groups?
Yeah, I think that's an important step. A lot of what we've seen in the last week, right, where sites have been, I mean, some of them have just been left homeless, right? There's nowhere for them to go now, and that's certainly valuable. I mean, the flip side, of course, is that, again, the backlash in response to that, it pisses folks off even more, and gives them more reason to claim victimhood, that their voices are being silenced. So we've just got to be prepared to react to that backlash.
And what would you like to be done by platforms like Twitter, or even more, I guess, French platforms like Gab? What would you like those platforms to do, if anything?
Well, I mean, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because we can't force them necessarily. We don't have any regulatory tools to do that at this point,
Hmm.
and they are, private businesses who have the right to decide what is there. But we need to continue to put that pressure on them, and for governments to find a way to regulate, because it's such a challenge in terms of jurisdiction and everything else. It's not just about um, you know not being able to push back against big media. It's about this game of whack-a-mole, right? If you deplatform in one place, they pop up somewhere else where we don't have jurisdiction, we don't have oversight. So it's also about, I think, sort of an international or global response to that. But in the meantime, we can continue to put pressure on the likes of Facebook and Twitter to deplatform folks who are engaging in dangerous speech, right? And I'm very adamant about that this is dangerous speech that we're talking about, that promotes vilification of and demonization of particular groups, that promotes violence against particular groups or against the state. No question in my mind that needs to be sort of deplatformed and not given a not given a stage
Hmm.
for sharing.
Right. And one issue with terrorism or anti-extremist research is also that these platforms haven't been proactive enough. Where I saw with the ISD report that you had to make that report for these accounts to be suspended and deplatformed, and groups to finally be deplatformed. Otherwise, they would have probably never caved to the pressure, because there would have been no pressure to begin with.
Yeah, and I think that the pressure is coming from so many directions right now that they're sort of being forced into a corner. It's coming from governments, not necessarily in terms of legislation, but in terms of, sort of negotiated settlements, if you will. It's coming from researchers. It's coming from, community activists. It's coming from educators who are saying, we don't want to, our kids should not be exposed to this, now, especially now where they're learning online,
Right.
where there's an increased likelihood that they'll stumble upon some of these sites. So, it's coming from virtually all quarters at this point.
And do you think there's enough pressure from researchers, government, private groups, or do you think it
Never
could be
enough
upped?
pressure, until they have said there is absolutely no tolerance, and as soon as we're aware of it, and I mean there's also this whole question of changing algorithms, so that we're not led down that rabbit hole on the likes of YouTube, for example, or even Facebook, and some of those other social media platforms. I mean that's something that absolutely needs to change. That they don't play a part in creating those echo chambers.
Hmm. And on the research side, do you think that the kind of research you do is sort of underappreciated and underfunded? I know that right-wing terrorism, even though it's almost one of the most, if not the most pervasive kind of extremism, is the one that's almost the least talked about, at least in Canada.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. The first grant that we got from public safety under the Kanishka project, which is the one that we did the report for 2015, when we went to the opening conference of that round of grants. So in the at that conference there were people who'd been funded, people who'd been previously funded, stakeholders from different government sectors, and other researchers as well. And in the introductory comments there were maybe two mentions of right-wing extremism, and that was really to dismiss it
Right.
as much as anything. And throughout the conference, most of the panels were devoted to ISIS and Islamist inspired extremists and terrorists. I think we had the only panel on right-wing extremism, and it was one of the best attended. So I think there was a hunger for it, and that was really, that was before 2015. That was before we started to see the uptick. That was, I think, 2012 we got the funding. And so 2015, 2016, that's when we started to see a change in the activity. And then 2016, 2017, we started to see a bit of a shift in terms of the attention being paid by government funders as well as researchers across the board, and the law enforcement and intelligence community, who were a little bit in denial of the reality of the threat posed by the far right. There's been I should say a significant shift since then. The Canada Center, oh my gosh, you all know the center I'm talking about at Public Safety,
Hmm.
Canada Center for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence,
I'll link it
has
in my video.
yeah. They have been really remarkable in terms of the partnership that we have with them, and the funding that we've had. They've funded a lot of not just research in the area, but interventions as well, and ways to challenge right-wing extremism. So they are certainly on top of it now. In terms of funding from other bodies in the government, not so much. Yeah. But I am gratified to see that there's a large number of up and coming students, master's students and PhD students and postdocs with an interest in this area. So funded or not, the research is really on a roll. We're on a roll with the research. We're really coming up to speed in that, and I'm really gratified by that.
Mhm. Fortunately, the center at public safety seems to be the exception, not the rule.
Mm-hmm,
And so,
mm-hmm.
why do you think there's such a disconnect between students like myself who view it as a threat, and there's a lot of interest in it? Is it because it's simply more attractive, or is it because law enforcement and intelligence agencies don't really? There's a disconnect there, and they don't want to, you know, house
Yeah, I mean,
themselves.
it's about change, right? Changing the culture. I mean, for so long, law enforcement and intelligence, when they think about extremism and terrorism, they're thinking about people who don't look like us, who were from somewhere else, and it's taking considerable effort to drag them into these conversations about the fact that yes, they do look like us, and yes, they are on our streets in our
Could you? Did my audio just go out?
you froze there for a bit, and I wasn't sure if I froze too.
Yeah. Could we? Could you restart that if that's okay? I think it's my internet.
Okay. Where did we start? What was the question?
So I
Oh,
asked
right.
if there
Okay.
was a
Yeah.
disconnect between students and government funding and government efforts.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think law enforcement is late to the game. That is, they've been preoccupied for since really since 9/11 with people who don't look like us, who aren't
From here.
and aren't from here, as being the greatest threat. And globally, yeah, I mean, there are certainly reasons to be concerned about the threat of Islamist-inspired violence. I mean, it is a global issue. On Canadian soil, it is not. Again, in that report, and subsequent to that report, we've identified over 120 incidents, and that was just for 2015. I mean, certainly the numbers have grown since then. Over 120 incidents associated with far right extremism. During the same period of time, we identified less than 10 incidents of violence associated with Islamist-inspired extremism in Canada. So that disparity, that sort of misplaced priority, I think really speaks volumes. So the change and cultural change and change in orientation and even funding models is slow to happen in law enforcement. And so I sort of been banging on the table for 5 years now, going on 6 years, about the need to pay attention. And we're getting some reactions finally. And it depends on the level of law enforcement we're talking about. It depends on location very often as well. But there's certainly been a shift.
And how do you deal with the death toll argument where they say, well, of course, there's been more incidents, but the death toll associated with Islamist extremism or Islamist inspired extremism is much higher than that of right-wing extremism?
But not in the Canadian context.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
We've had just in the last 8 years or so, over 20 homicides associated with right-wing extremism. How many associated with Islamist-inspired extremism? Two,
Hmm.
three, maybe. Yeah. So that argument has no basis in the data.
Hmm. And how do you deal with law enforcement officials, intelligence officials who would usually argue against you with the points you're bringing
And
forth
they often
today?
do. Well, one of the distinctions that they often make is the distinction between national security and public safety. And so, terrorism is not an issue of, for them, is not an issue of public safety. It's an issue of national security. Well,
That
one, I would say, yeah,
that's
it is also your job. Public safety is also your job, even if you're RCMP. But B, right-wing extremism is also a threat to national security. Corey Hearn, showing up with 4 guns to arrest Prime Minister Trudeau is a threat to national security. I think even the threats that are posed to their targeted communities is a threat to national security, because it tears at the fabric of multiculturalism, that for most of us is really what we value about Canada. So, neither argument is for me is very persuasive.
so. Do you think they're simply dodging and obfuscating to hide their faults, or do you think they actually believe in what they're proposing?
No, I think that is a genuine their genuine perspective. I don't think there's any obfuscation there. I think that's really the way that they see this distinction. So especially when we're talking about, because even if an act of terrorism happens in Toronto, RCMP rushes in and takes over if it's considered to be terrorism, and so there's a fine line between what is hate crime and therefore the um, belongs to local police, and what is terrorism and then belongs to the RCMP, and that line is blurry. It's often political in terms of where you draw that line. So even the case of the Quebec City mosque shootings, I mean, neither hate crime nor terrorism charges were laid there,
Hmm.
but arguably it could have been considered either one. And the fact that it was neither is especially problematic. But even at the time, there was a rejection of the notion of identifying it as terrorism, and no good reason for that, I feel, was ever offered.
And
So
part of the issue with that is that usually, as you mentioned, right-wing extremism cases are usually relayed to local and provincial police forces, which are even less equipped than federal ones, or less
mhm,
knowledgeable than federal ones. And
mhm.
usually, what happens with that is simply leads nowhere.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that could be probably a big recommendation going forward, where right-wing extremist cases could also be handled by federal forces, not necessarily simply
Mhm.
local and provincial ones.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there needs to be equivalency. That's one place where I see equivalency, right?
Mhm.
If it's terrorism, and RCMP needs to swoop in. It elevates, I think, the profile. It elevates the importance and the significance of these sorts of events. Um, not to use them to embolden, right, supporters, but to remind us that, yeah, this is also a problem, and this is also a threat to both public safety and national security.
That's a big role of government for sure, to identify what people should care about, what values we
Hmm.
espouse, and if they do not say that right-wing extremism is a problem, then of course it's going to continue to
Yeah.
be harbored and grow, and
Yep.
definitely an issue.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what other changes would you like to be seen from law enforcement, intelligence, military groups?
Well, I think let's react, let's respond, let's use the legislation that we have to intervene. But I think it's also not just a law enforcement and not just a government issue. I mean, we've argued from the get-go that it is a multidimensional problem, and it
Hmm.
requires a multi-sectoral response. So it's not just to law enforcement, but to public health authorities, even to intervene, for social services. We have very few supports in this country for people who are being led down that path, or people who want to come out of the movement. I think we need to develop more strategies in that respect. And that can be, I mean, I was talking to, an agency in Toronto, for example, that does work with youth and families. And, they said they've begun to develop programs for youth in particular who seem to be being groomed for the far right. And their experience was, or their observation has been, that other social service agencies and mental health agencies won't touch these cases.
Hmm.
And so it's sort of fallen to them. They've become one of the hubs for this work, and that's really dangerous, right? If we're not willing to provide those supports. So I think the mental health field, social service field, needs to develop the capacity there. Education, obviously, interventions for youth, which are still you know I don't know about primary targets, but key targets for recruitment. We tend to forget that adults are also recruited, and that's, I think, one of the bigger challenges, right? Because you've got a captive audience of youth in the schools, but how do you engage with adults? Because the
Hmm.
movement is older now.
That's
It's
right,
not just a youth movement. We're seeing a lot of
especially
middle-aged and
right-wing
older people.
extremist movements.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the labor movement, for example, is so important there in developing strategies for engaging folks in these kinds of dialogues, countering the conspiracy theories where they can in the workplace,
Hmm.
days, workplace days of action, those sorts of things. So yeah, I think that that many of us have a role to play
Hmm.
in both preventing and responding to far right extremism.
And when public health agencies usually don't want to take these cases because they're too risky, they could harm public image. Usually they fall into police forces, which
Hmm.
I'm sure you'll share that they shouldn't.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
already have too many things to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Yeah, because yeah, I mean, these are not just criminal justice issues. These are certainly social justice issues as well that we need to respond to.
mhm. And are you hopeful about perhaps, well, if the Trudeau government stays in power or if there's a change of government, are you hopeful about the prospects in regarding the government reaction to right-wing extremism and extremism, or are you not?
Not particularly. I mean, we haven't seen much yet in terms of concrete strategies. Yeah, there's funding through the center, and there are programs being developed through the center. But aside from that, there's not a great deal of even. I'd be happy to see some gestures, but we don't even see much in the way of gestures, political gestures, and public stance against far right extremism. I think Jagmeet Singh has been much more vocal than has the prime minister. So definitely need to hear some more pounding on the table from our politicians about the need to counter the rise and persistence of the far right. So I mean that's for me that should become, and it's not just about the far right, but it's about this climate of hate really needs to be a key issue in the election. We need to see some commitment to action around online hate, organized hate, hate crime, the expansion of hate crime units, the strengthening of hate crime units across the country, because we've also seen a dramatic growth in police reported hate crimes. So, we need to do more in that area as well.
Hmm. That's right. And are you fearful of parties embracing those movements and ideologies with phrases like "Take Back Canada"?
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Please do not play those games, right? We've seen the dangers of that. And if anything, if there's anything positive to come out of what's happening in the US right now, hopefully that's the lesson, the dangers of engaging in that kind of speech, that kind of promotion, whether it's tacit or explicit um, support for the sort of the hatred and the vitriol that's associated with the far right. um, that's just it's we've seen the dangers of that. We really don't want to go that direction, and I think that we've seen in some of well, the not the last federal election but before that, where there were some attempts to really promote anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment in particular, and I felt like the liberal win then was a repudiation of those values. The fact that the People's Party,
Completely
has
fell
not,
flat.
yeah, I think is encouraging as well, that we just don't have that same appetite or even tolerance for those sorts of narratives here.
Hmm. And before we go, is there anything you'd like us to discuss or anything you'd like to ask?
No, I think you've covered some good ground there. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you again for your time. For those of you who are interested, I'd recommend you read, just our listeners out there, if there are that many, but I'd recommend you
There
read,
are at least dozens.
there are at least dozens. I'd recommend you read the ISD report, which Dr. Perry worked on, as well as her 2019 book, Right-Wing Extremism in Canada. I'd say those are two good starting points. And with that, uh, thank you again for your time, and
Thank you.
look forward to chatting more.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Have a nice day. This concludes today's episode of Realpolitik, where I discussed the extent of right-wing extremism in Canada with expert Dr. Barbara Perry. It was a pleasure having her on, and I thank her for her time, patience, and service. Feel free to debate the ideas put forward in these episodes by submitting a comment, counter video, or by emailing us at realpolitikpodcast1@gmail.com. Please check out our Patreon if you would like to support us as well. Thank you and take care.